So we're going to go through putting together an Rmarkdown, or generally how to put together Rmarkdowns. And so the goal by the end of the workshop is for everyone here to have published an Rmarkdown of their own. And so in terms of all the things that we'll be doing to get to that point, I'll define Rmarkdowns and we'll walk through creating an example one. We'll talk more about what other things you can do with Rmarkdowns. And then you'll have a chance to turn some R code that you already have into an Rmarkdown. And then I'll walk through a couple of options for publishing those Rmarkdowns. So we'll walk through publishing on both RStudio Connect and on RPubs. So hopefully by the end, everyone will have a published Rmarkdown. Just going to dive right into talking about how to make an Rmarkdown and making an example of one. So I'm going to share my screen, and that'll take a minute to get everything set up. Okay, can everyone see my RStudio window? Okay, trying hard not to make the mistake I made during one workshop where I was sharing the wrong screen for like 15 minutes before someone said something. That was a little embarrassing. Okay, so to start off with some context for Rmarkdowns and what we're doing here is talking about sort of the broader concept of what Rmarkdowns fit into. And so that concept is referred to as literate programming. And while that sounds like a kind of complicated term, it's a little bit more straightforward than it sounds. Basically, literate programming is this concept of combining text or narrative with your code and then output from that code. And so it's kind of like in a normal R script, you have your code and you can intersperse it with some comments. But doing this literate programming approach is basically like taking your comments and going much further with them and providing a lot more detail and context for what you're doing, why, and what it means. And so, I mean, if anyone's familiar with, for example, Jupyter Notebooks, that's also kind of a literate programming approach of combining chunks of text interspersed with chunks of code, and then that code can be executed. And so one of the great things about Rmarkdowns is the ability to sort of automatically create reports and update reports or papers. And so probably everyone here has had an experience where you've written a paper or report in a Word document or Google document. You copy and paste your figures from R into that document. You also can copy and paste or type in numbers from your analyses. But as we know, that is very error prone by doing it by hand. And then if there are any changes made to the underlying data due to cleaning it or using a different data set, then you have to update all of those parts of a document. And it can be really hard to keep track of what everything is. And so luckily within our Markdown, that's all built in to automatically update. So all you have to do is knit your Markdown, and any of the numbers or figures that come from a data set will be automatically updated. So it makes things a lot easier. Both for writing reports, which a few people specifically mentioned in the pre-workshop survey, and then also writing things like dissertations or publications. So hopefully that convinces you enough that this is a really great tool. I think it's compared to some other things too, I feel like Rmarkdown has a lower barrier to entry. Like once you're already familiar with R, I don't think it takes quite as much to learn how to use Rmarkdown. Okay, so is there any questions about that? Otherwise, we'll get started and we're going to create our first Rmarkdown, or second or third or some number for some folks. So hopefully you've had a chance to open up RStudio and have already installed R in RStudio. And additionally, we need the R package Rmarkdown for this. And so if you want to test to make sure that you have it installed, you can read in the Rmarkdown library by just typing in library and Rmarkdown. And if that works, you won't have any output. Okay, and so in order to create an Rmarkdown file, just like you'd create an R script, You can click either on this button here, or you can click on the file button, and then go ahead and select Rmarkdown. And so you should have a window pop up like this. You'll see on the left-hand side, there's a few different options for the type of Rmarkdown you're going to create. We're going to start off with this sort of the default, which is document. But we'll talk a little bit later about all of the other things you can do with Rmarkdown, which includes creating presentations and including dynamic sort of widgets with Shiny. We're going to put a title in to our report. And so I'm going to be using a data set that's on rodents just as an example. And I'm not going to get too deep into any of the ecology background, but I'm an ecologist and it's a data set that's used a lot for teaching. So feel free to ask me questions about it if you want, but I'm going to call this then, I'm going to call it just rodent report, real simple. If you want to go ahead and call it that too. And then author name, it already automatically input mine, but you can type in your name here. And then we have this, the output that we want our Rmarkdown to come into. And so there's a few different options here. Rmarkdowns really are designed to then generate rendered HTMLs, but you can also output PDFs, as you can see one of the options here, if you install some other stuff first, or you can actually render them as Word documents. And so those can be helpful ways to share with collaborators, especially if they're a little less tech savvy than y'all are. But we're going to go with HTML to start with. And so you can hit OK. And then it should produce produce a file that looks, your file should look something like this. So if you were not able to get to this point, can you should let me know. Was everybody able to create a new Rmarkdown? Yes, and using reactions is great. If you want to do thumbs up reaction, that is really helpful for me to know who's on the same page as me. Okay, so now we have our Rmarkdown file. And you can see there's a few different parts to this. The first part is this part at the top. So this there's content in between these 3 dashes. So 3 start dashes and then 3 end dashes. And this, which is referred to as a YAML stub, is basically just some metadata about your Rmarkdown. And so you can see that that pop-up window auto-filled our title, author name. It also put in today's date. And then we specified we wanted it in HTML, so the output is an HTML document. And so this, this little stub was automatically generated from what we put in the pop-up window, but you can also edit this by hand if you want to change things later on. Okay, so that's sort of the bit at the beginning. And then all the rest of this is content. And so they put some example material here, but we're going to go ahead and we're going to delete all of that. So from that second set of 3 dashes, delete everything after that, and we're going to put in our own content. Okay, and so I mentioned in the beginning that Rmarkdowns combine text and code. So the first part of this we're going to talk about is the text part of the Rmarkdowns. And so we can just type in normal text here and it'll just turn out as normal sentences. But additionally, we can actually add in some formatting to our text. So we can do things like bold words or create lists. And just to give some context for how we do that, the way that we do that, as opposed to something like, you know, when you're writing a Word doc, you can highlight a letter or a word and you can click a button and it'll bold the text. But we're going to use something called Markdown for formatting our text instead. And so Markdown is a concept that existed before Rmarkdowns and is used in a lot of different ways, especially on the internet for creating web pages and stuff. But basically, Markdown is a way to format your text in a way that's a little bit more explicit and then a little bit easier to read than something like HTML. Okay, and so I'm talking about this thing, but we haven't actually done any of it yet. But we're going to use Markdown to format some of our text. And so I'll walk you through a chunk of text and we'll format it along the way. And we can talk about these different approaches. Okay, so the first chunk of text that I'm going to include in this report, and you should do it along with me, is a section that's about the purpose of the report. So it's a pretty normal thing. You know, the first thing you do at the beginning of a report or a paper is have a summary of what you're going to do. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a purpose section, and I want to add a header to that. And so the way that you do headers in Markdown is by using pound symbols. So similar looking to comments in our scripts, but these will be headers instead. And so the way you do a header is you do more pound symbols, the smaller you want the header to be. So 1 pound symbol before a word will create a large header, and then 3 or 4 pound symbols will create a smaller one. So we'll do 2 pound symbols to create a second level header, and we're going to call this section purpose. Okay, and so we'll just say the purpose for this is to exploring rodent population data at the portal project. Okay, and so especially if that sounds mysterious to you, that's fine. So the data we're using as an example here is from an experiment that is done in Arizona, actually, out in the Chiricahuas, where they're collecting a bunch of the different rodents and weighing them and measuring them and then letting them go over time. And so the location of that, the field site, is referred to as the portal project. Okay, so now we have a sentence here. It's just plain old text right now, but we want to add some more formatting to it using Markdown. And so let's say we want to make portal project bold. And so the way that we can do that is by putting 2 asterisks at the beginning and then at the end. So we'll put 2 asterisks before portal and then 2 asterisks after project. And you can actually see our studio is trying to help us by letting us know we did something to that text by turning it blue as opposed to black. Okay, and so you can do various things to text. You can make things bold, you can italicize, you can underline. I think you can strike through text too. And additionally, if you do a lot of things with math or with chemical compounds, you can also do superscripts and subscripts. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. And then we're going to add one more thing onto this little introductory section, and then we're going to actually render this into an HTML. So the last thing I'm going to talk about here are creating lists. So you can create lists in Markdown. You can do unordered lists by doing using asterisks. So I'm going to say I'm going to put a list of tasks for this Rmarkdown. And so if you want it unordered, you can use an asterisk and a space and then write out whatever you're writing out, or you can replace the asterisk with a dash or plus symbol. And so I'm going to do an order list so it'll be with numbers. And so you do a number, a dot, and a space. And so we're going to load data from database. And our second step will be to keying data into time series. And then the third step will be make plot. Okay. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Katie. Katie shared a cheat sheet, and we'll talk about those in a second, because there are lots of other things you can do with Markdown. The last thing that I tend to do really often is to take words in my Markdown or in my text and turn them into hyperlinks. And so I'm going to take this word database and I'm going to turn it into a hyperlink that links to a Figshare archive of the data. And so the way you do that is whatever word you want to turn into a hyperlink, you put in square brackets, and then right after that with no space, put parentheses. And then the URL that you want to link to is going to go in the parentheses. And so I will copy and paste that URL into the chat. And I will paste it into the parentheses just like y'all should too. Okay, so now we have the beginnings of an Rmarkdown. We have some text, and that text is formatted using Markdown. But let's actually render this and see what it looks like and prove to ourselves that I'm not just like telling you to type this random stuff for no reason. So the first thing that we need to do is save this, and then we can edit it. And so you can save this wherever you want on your computer. And I'm going to call this rodent report.rmd. And so once you've saved it, there should be a knit button right here if you have Rmarkdown and knitter installed. And you can go ahead and click on that. It's probably a keyboard shortcut for knitting too, but I actually don't know what it is offhand. Okay, and so here we have our rendered HTML of what we've made so far. And so you can see we have a header, we have bolded text, we have our list that's nicely formatted, and then we have our link. If we click on it, should pull up the Figshare for this data set. So this is just all the archived data. Okay. And yeah, so Katie linked to some resources for other things that you can do in Markdown besides what we've done here. So that was basically just some of the very basic things, but you can do a lot more stuff. So yeah, we have things like headers, have paragraphs and line breaks. Yeah, this one's more extensive. I actually haven't looked at this one before.
I used the heck out of this, and that's why I shared it. There is I sent two, so that one is just a simplified link, but this one was really helpful, that first one. But I have them bookmarked and I use them all the time.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, this one's nice for like, if you already know how to do something, you just want to be reminded, like, oh, what exactly do I do to make a quote? And then this one looks like it's more detailed, a little bit more about the what and the why. So, and I use a couple others. I look at the GitHub Markdown one a lot. Because there's some different flavors of Markdown, and GitHub has their own like slightly different flavor. And so this is another one that's kind of cheat sheety. And then the actual Rmarkdown book also has, I thought I had a link to it. Yeah, there's tons of resources for this online. So this is an important resource that everyone should at least be familiar with, is that this is the sort of the official Rmarkdown book. And so there's a lot of content in here. I wouldn't recommend like sitting down and reading this, but you can read different sections as they're appropriate to you. And I think they have a section here about Markdown formatting. So yeah, beyond what we'll get into here, you can make tables with Markdown. You can do equations if you do a lot of math in your reports. And there's something else I want to mention. Oh, you can also insert images. So if you have like PNGs or something of, you know, a logo or something like that, you can insert those into your Markdown too, or into your Rmarkdown. So yeah, there's a lot of extensive stuff here. I won't really be able to cover all of it, but this hopefully will help people get started and know where to look when you want to try to do something, you can't figure it out. Okay, has everyone been able to get up to this point of having an Rmarkdown with some Markdown in it? If you do, can you give me a thumbs up? Cool, and yeah, analog thumbs ups are just as good as digital. Okay, great. Okay, so we said at the beginning that our Markdowns are combining text and code. And so we've just done text so far, but let's go ahead and put in some code too. And so the way that you put code into these is you put in these chunks that indicate to R and RStudio that this is specifically code and it should be executed. And so we insert our chunks. There's a few different ways to do this. One way is by going up to the code button and click insert chunk. There's also a keyboard shortcut for creating these that is Command Option I, or I think on Windows it's Control Option I. And so I use that a lot. Yeah, so this is a chunk that indicates to the computer that this is supposed to be code in here instead of text. And you can actually type these out by hand too. Like you can type 3 backticks and then a curly brace, R, and curly brace, and then you end it with 3 backticks. There's nothing special about this. It really is just text. But then this is the computer interprets it as, you know, there's code in here. Okay, so just as a simple first example, we're just going to put in some R code for reading in a couple libraries. And so I'm going to read in dplyr, which is a data manipulation and cleaning package that's part of the tidyverse. And then we're also going to read in ggplot. And so if you don't use tidyverse tools, if you use BaseR or other approaches, this is not a workshop about those things. And we won't get into detail very much. So if you don't have to understand, you can just copy and paste the code that I'll use later on. So we'll read in those 2 libraries, dplyr and ggplot2. And so now when we knit this, what happens behind the scenes sort of is that it starts a brand new R session and then executes any of those chunks of R code that are in your Rmarkdown. And so we just have one right now. And you can see that it did something and then produced some output, because when you read in dplyr, you know, if you do this in the console, for example, it'll output some of these messages that are just informational. And so now in this new R session that was created when we knitted, we now have these 2 libraries read in. And to keep track of what my sections are, I'm going to add a header above this chunk that just says read in packages. And then we'll create a new section, and we're going to go ahead and call that, we'll say that read in data is what we're going to do here. Okay, and we'll create a second R chunk here, and I'm going to go ahead and we'll read in, we'll pull down some data from a URL and read it in. So I'm just going to call this data, use read.csv, and then I will post the URL in this chat. Okay, and so this is some of that portal data that I was talking about, the rodent data. So you just copy and paste that into your read.csv argument. And then we're going to go ahead and read out the first 6 lines of that using head. Okay, now when we knit this, you might notice that every single time you knit, it automatically saves the file for you too, which is kind of nice. But now when we knit this, we see that we have this new data, this new chunk of R code is being displayed in the HTML. And then we can also see the first 6 lines of this data set. And just very briefly to talk about the contents of this data set, like I said, they're collecting rodents, taking some information on them, and then releasing them again. And so the information that we have here is each row is each time they captured a rodent. And so we have information about the date on which they were collected, which plot, because they have a bunch of different plots there they were collected in, what species the rodent is, their sex, how big their hind foot is, and then weight. These top ones just happen to not have weight. So I've actually gone out to this field site before and helped them collect rodents before. And oftentimes when they're missing weight or hind foot length or sex is because when they collect the rodents, sometimes the rodents like escape in the middle of trying to take data. They can be very wily. So yeah, I don't know if that was all just escaped rodents or maybe they just didn't measure weight back then. Okay, so we have so far, we have our Rmarkdown with a description of what's going on in this Rmarkdown, and then we've read in a couple R packages and read in some data. So before we move on to just a very basic example of cleaning up this data and plotting it, we should talk about the different options that you have available with these R chunks. And so this is a really, really useful part about doing Rmarkdowns is that you can do a lot of different things with what and how things are displayed from these R chunks. So to do a couple examples of those, so the options go in the curly braces. After the R, you put a comma and then a space. And then you can actually see now all of the different optional arguments for the chunks pop up here. So that's one way to explore all these options. So the one that we're going to use for this first chunk is we're going to do message equals. And it's set to default to be true. We're going to set it to false. And so that means that these outputs from the dplyr package being read in won't show up anymore in our HTML. Another example of an option that we're going to use for the second R chunk is to set the cache equals true. And so because every single time you knit this, it's going and re-downloading this data and then reading it in. If we cache it, then it keeps the data in a cache, so it doesn't have to re-download it every time. So those are just a couple examples of options that you can use for your R chunks. So when you knit that, hopefully what I said is true. Does someone have a question?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Is that just for that single chunk, or does that work for the entire Markdown page?
That is a really good question. So if you set an option in a chunk, it only applies to that chunk. But you can also set default options that will apply to every single chunk. So if you're doing the same thing on every single chunk, you can set the default options for that.
Okay,
and
cool.
the way you do that, which I always forget how, I think it might be here. I don't remember how to find this here. Here we go. So yeah, this is kind of small. I don't know if I can make it any bigger. But yeah, so basically, if you want to set the same options for all of your chunks, you can have a chunk at the very beginning, and you use this knitter argument ops chunk set, and then you just specify all the arguments that you want to use. So yeah, avoiding having to,
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. It's a good question. Okay. So yeah, when I knit that, and when you knit that, hopefully then you saw that, for example, the dplyr messages are gone now. Now it's just showing the code. And so you can set options, for example, if you want it, and we'll do this in a little bit, but you can set it so that it doesn't display the code at all, but still executes it and produces the output. And yeah, and you can set, like, for example, how big figures are displayed. I think there's a lot of other options. It's worth exploring all of these different options for your code. Okay, so one last thing, and this is one of the most nice, well, one of the many nice things about Rmarkdown. Referring to what I was talking about earlier, the whole copying and pasting, individual numbers into a Word document. So you can actually generate numbers from your analyses and stick them right into your text. So basically on one line, you can combine text and R code. And so I'm going to type out an example of that and then talk about the components of it. Feel free to type this as I'm typing. Okay, I'll give everyone a second. If you want to copy this. And then we can talk about what it means. Okay, so basically what this line should render as, what it should end up looking like in the HTML is it should say the data includes, then some number, and then species. And so the way this is working is this is just normal text like we were doing before. But then if you put stuff within, one backtick to start and one backtick to end, and you start it with R, everything that goes in between the R and then the last backtick is interpreted as R code. And so it'll actually execute this. And so what this should do is it looks into that data that we read in, and it counts the number of unique species in the species column. And so when you knit that, hopefully that is true, if I haven't made any mistakes. Yep, so now we have this sentence that is rendered in the HTML, but we actually included some information about the data in a very programmatic and automated way. So that is just a very, very nice, useful thing, especially when you're writing reports or your dissertation, for example. I definitely did a lot of copy and pasting of things in my PhD dissertation, and it was not fun. Okay, so the last little bit that we're going to do right here in this Rmarkdown is do a very short sort of reorganization and cleanup of this data, and then plot it. And I'll copy and paste the code into the chat too for folks who, if you don't have a lot of experience with dplyr or with ggplot. So, but what we're going to do, I'm going to create a new section. And I'm going to say clean up data and plot. And then I create a new R chunk, and I'm going to create this time series data, or sorry, this time series data frame from the data object. Give everybody a minute to type that in or copy and paste. Okay, and so basically what this is doing is we're taking that data frame, and then it's so grouping by the species ID and the year, and then counting the number of occurrences. So what this should return is the number of individuals counted each year for each species. So if you knit it, and I did the returning the first 6 lines of that new data frame time series, and we see that that is what we get. So we have our species ID, which these are species that they didn't identify for whatever reason, the year, and then the number of individuals counted. So if you look further down in this data frame, you'll start seeing actual species IDs. Okay, so now we've done a little bit with the data. We're going to go ahead and plot that. So I'll create another R chunk, and I'm going to use ggplot to do this. So just like before, I'll type this out and I'll copy and paste it into the chat. Okay, sorry. Okay, so once you've had a chance, either type that out or copy and paste it. Oh, before we knit it, I'm actually going to add in a couple more, a couple of the chunk options here. So the first one I'm going to do is I'm going to say message equals false, because plotting this produces some messages. And then I'm going to use the echo equals false argument option. And so echo is the one that specifies whether or not you should display the code. And so when you set it to false, it means that the code for generating the plot won't be displayed. And so that's nice, especially if you're writing reports for people who are not, not interested or don't need to know about the underlying R code that generates your figures or your data sets. So when we knit this, hopefully we will have, we will have a figure at the bottom. And so you see the code for generating that figure is not there. And also any messages that that code would have generated are not there either. All we have is this plot of number of individuals observed across time by species. So, and hopefully if you're not using dplyr or ggplot yet, maybe this will be a little bit of a teaser / incentive for how powerful they are. Okay, I think there's one more thing I wanted to mention. Yes. So knitting these can sometimes take a little bit of time, and especially if you're actually trying to sort of develop new R code within your Rmarkdown, it can be a little bit onerous. And so one thing that I do when I'm sort of developing R code iteratively is you can actually run each of these chunks within the R console. So if you click within a chunk that you want to run, and then you click run up here, there's a bunch of different options, but you can run the current chunk, and that'll actually execute it down in the console. So if you want to be doing a little bit more, at least to begin with, a little bit more iterative R code where you're sort of figuring out what you want to do, this can be a little faster. But it is important to remember that you can run the chunks out of order. And so like stuff won't work. For example, if you read in a data set and then you plot it, but you run the plotting chunk and not the data set chunk, it won't work. So just keep that in mind. And then it's a really nice test that you have a full, complete set of code when you knit it, because like I said, every single time you knit, it starts a new R session. So anything that you've done sort of interactively in the console won't be included necessarily in your Rmarkdown. Okay, so I think that's sort of the basics of Rmarkdown. We've all created this sort of example Rmarkdown using roted data. So do people have any questions right now about that or thoughts?
Quick, easy question. Is there a way to comment in our Markdown file such that we know what we're doing when we read through it, 6 months after the fact?
So you're talking about commenting the code?
Commenting the code, or just within the Rmarkdown, commenting in general, or within the code?
Yeah, yes. So you can do both. So for example, this is just normal R code. And so if you wanted to say like, generate time series data with dplyr, when you knit this, that comment will show up in your chunk of R code. But additionally, and so what I do now, I actually tend to not use comments in the R scripts much anymore at all. I tend to put them into the text. So I'll be like, subsetting data for, or summarizing data for number of occurrences per year and per species. And so that's really the intent behind some of this, is to have a lot more of that narrative about what you've done. And this is so helpful for when you come back later on, like 6 months or a year, and you're like, what did I do? Because I kind of feel like, as opposed to just doing comments in your code, I feel like the Rmarkdowns encourage having a lot more text and a lot more description of what you're doing and why. Because you can also have, at a higher level what you're doing, or you can talk about like, if you choose to do some cleaning steps, like, removed 0 values and NAs and species X because they went extinct or something like that. So you can have a little bit more like descriptive narrative about what you did and why. And you can do that like in normal R scripts with comments, but I feel like I at least have been encouraged to not have super long or, super long R comments, or like why. The motivation isn't always there. It's just the what. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it sure does. Thank you.
Awesome. Good one. Do other folks have thoughts about this right now? Hopefully I just explained everything so perfectly. I don't expect to do that necessarily. So if I say something that doesn't make sense, definitely feel free to ask me like what I said. Okay. So Katie brought up some good resources for doing Markdown. And as I said before, there's the Rmarkdown book. This is an excellent resource for figuring out what to do. There's also a cheat sheet on Rmarkdown from RStudio. So this is a really nice resource too, kind of like those, the Markdown cheat sheets. This is an Rmarkdown cheat sheet. And so if you're just trying to remember, you know, how to do something, this is a really good resource. And of course, Googling and looking at posts on Stack Overflow and things like that can be really helpful, or other people's blog posts about doing Rmarkdowns. And then I also wanted to mention, so what we did here, we just have made a fairly straightforward report, read in some data, plotted the data, cleaned the data. And this is, I mean, this is the vast majority of what I use Rmarkdown for, but you can also do a ton of other stuff. And so if you explore this book, it goes through a lot of those things. And I just wanted to mention them because I even forget sometimes how many things you can do using Rmarkdowns as the base. But so for example, you can actually put other programming languages into your Rmarkdowns. So I've put in Python code, for example, you know, instead of, and the way you do that is that you just replace the R here with the name of the language that you're using. I think Python is just Python, or it might just be Py. So you can put in other languages here if you are working with other programming languages. You can use Rmarkdown along with an R package called Bookdown to create books, which is actually what they use to create this Rmarkdown book. So each of the pages in this book are actually just an Rmarkdown that are rendered. And then Bookdown is the R package is used to sort of glue them together and have a table of contents. And relatedly, there's another similarly named R package called Blogdown. And that you can use Rmarkdowns to create websites from. And so that's starting to become even more common for people's professional websites, is to use Blogdown to create a fairly simple website. Some of the other things that you can do with Rmarkdowns, like I said, you can make presentation slides with it. And I think there's a section in here about that, actually a long section. Here's a short section of it. So you can create presentations using Rmarkdowns. I've never actually done this before, but I feel like it's one of those things where you'd have to put in a little bit more upfront work, but then it's easier to reuse the material. You can also, so if you're writing a report or a publication that has references in it, you can combine the Rmarkdown with a bibliography and automatically generate both the reference list and also in-text citations. So you can, if you have a reference list, I think then you can put in the text, the citations. It's something like at White 2008 or something like that. And then so you can have a list of references, and then this will actually expand out the reference to the format that you want it to be in. So that's really nice. Another thing I also haven't really used. And the last big thing is that you can do interactive widgets within your Rmarkdowns. And there's a section in the book about that. I think this one shows a pretty nice example. So you can throw in things like this, an interactive map where you can like zoom in and out. And so you can do this using the HTML widgets package, or you can also actually put it in Shiny components. And so those are then very dynamic and interactive. For example, you can have a plot where people can change what the parameters are in the plot, or you can include a data table where people can then like search or filter through that data in a very interactive way. And then, oh, and one last thing is you can create dashboards. And somebody actually asked about that in the pre-workshop survey. And I had not created a dashboard before, but I decided to try to do it. And let's see here. Let's see if I can get it to render. So I created a dashboard using some of the components that we used in the example Rmarkdown that we just created. So let's see if this works. Of course, demoing things doesn't always go very well. Ha, okay, great. Yeah, so this is just a like really not very great dashboard, but I threw this together. And so basically you can have different components on your dashboard. You can have plots, you can have text, you can have, these are like little value boxes, I think they're called. You can have these sort of like meters. There's a lot of different things that you can include in these dashboards. So especially if you're presenting like reports or data to people, this can be a really nice way to do it. And you can include these interactive elements in these dashboards too. You can include like shiny components or HTML widgets. So yeah, and you can specify like the rows and the columns and how they're sort of oriented and how many pieces are in each of them. So yeah, if somebody wants to try this during the section where we're doing our own work, I can try to help, but it is something that I only recently know how to do now, but it is really neat.
So it's using its own components in addition to Shiny, or you can use Shiny in this? This is pretty neat.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to include a couple of, there is a couple of components that you have to include in your Rmarkdown, I think in the metadata.
Okay.
I tried to do it and I couldn't quite get it to work. But yeah, then you can include an R chunk where you do a Shiny component. Like for example, oh, I did say that, okay. Yeah, I was trying to get the Shiny part of this to work too, but I ran out of time. So yeah, you can.
There's something you could do is pretty awesome. It's very
yeah.
for me.
It's really neat. I was all excited. I was like, I wonder if I can get this rodent data into a table and then people can filter by it. Like that was a little ambitious for having like 10 minutes. But yeah, you just put in another R chunk with specifically with Shiny commands and you should be able to knit this and then it would have your interactive element right here. And so obviously if you send somebody just, well, not obviously, sorry. If you send somebody like just this HTML file and you have interactive components, it's not going to work because HTML is really only static. But if you host this somewhere, then you can send the URL link to somebody, and then they should be able to actually use the interactive part of it. And so that's what we'll get to at the very end of this workshop is we'll talk about publishing our Markdowns and a couple of ways to do that. So, but before we get to that, do folks have other questions or thoughts about some of this stuff? Okay, so the last topic that I wanted to talk about in these last 20 minutes is to walk everyone through how to actually publish your Rmarkdowns. Because if you want someone else to be able to see it, you can save these as PDFs or as Word documents, like I talked about before, and just email them to somebody. But it is very nice to be able to actually publish your Rmarkdown online somewhere, and then you can send the URL to anyone. And then if you update it, they can see the updated version of it. And so, yeah. And so I'm going to talk about the two different ways that you can publish your Rmarkdowns. And I'll actually walk through doing this if I have time. So there are, as far as I'm aware, there are two ways to publish your Rmarkdowns. One is using Rpubs, which is a free service provided by RStudio, I think. And then the other way is using RStudio Connect. And so that is a paid for product. And so there's some advantages and disadvantages to using either Rpubs or RStudio Connect for publishing your Rmarkdowns. So I will say that I found that Rpubs was a little bit easier and it's also free. So anybody can use it. I assume they probably have some limit on how big your Rmarkdowns are, or how many you maybe can publish using it. But you can publish whatever content you want. And additionally, if you, like, for example, are doing an Rmarkdown for like class assignments, it's okay to put those on Rpubs. From working with Rpubs, though, there are some limitations. I found that when you update an Rmarkdown and then push it to your Rpubs, it can be finicky sometimes about actually updating. And also you can't work on an Rmarkdown collaboratively. So one person owns the Rmarkdown and can push it. And then someone else can take your Rmarkdown and they can also publish themselves, but it would be a separate product then. And then so RStudio Connect, like I mentioned before, the other way to publish is a product put out by our studio that you have to pay for. And so U of A actually got a license for this year. So part of this is sort of promoting everyone to use our Studio Connect, because if we're going to pay for it, it's good for people to use it. And so unlike RPubs, it is, I think, from me using it so far, at least, you can actually collaborate. You can add collaborators to your published document and they can make changes to it. And another thing that is relevant to a couple people here, at least, is that you can actually schedule updates to your Rmarkdowns in our Studio Connect. So it has a scheduler thing in there and you can have it update daily or weekly. And then so if the underlying data changes, it should be able to automatically update your published product. And then you can also have it automatically send emails about the updates to yourself and to other people. And I've just started digging into some of that. So, and I think, and then one of the limitations about the RStudio Connect through U of A is that they do emphasize that it should be a place where you put research products, not necessarily just like toy examples or class documents. And so folks who had a chance to sign up for our RStudio Connect may see that. And that actually, yes, I think I sent everyone the link to the RStudio Connect for U of A. Nope, that's the wrong one. That is a general one. This is the one I want. I cannot find the link that I'm looking for. Sorry. There we go. Yeah, so this is the page on the U of A's website for our Studio Connect. And so some of y'all were able to go ahead and request access to this service. And they do emphasize here that whatever you put in our Studio Connect should be primarily for research purposes, not for teaching purposes necessarily. So that is one limitation of our Studio Connect. So yeah, we have these two platforms that you all are able to use either of, depending on what your needs and your wants are. So before I go ahead and actually show everyone how to publish on our Studio Connect and then on RPubs, does anyone have any questions? Okay. So I will walk through putting one of my Rmarkdowns on our Studio Connect. If you were able to get an RStudio account, and I know a few of you were, I'm sorry, an RStudio Connect account, and I know a few you're able to, you can go ahead and do this with your Rmarkdown right now, following along with me if you want. And that'd be great to see some of those actually published. Okay, and so I have this Rmarkdown that's from a project that I'm on, in which I did some data curation and some plotting. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to publish this on RStudio Connect. And so the first thing that you have to do is to connect your RStudio to your RStudio Connect to that server. And so the way that you do that is oh goodness, global options, I think. Yep, okay. Yeah, so if you go back up and do that again. If you go up to tools in RStudio and you go to global options, you should be able to go to this publishing tab right here. And you can already see I'm already connected, but if you click connect and then choose RStudio Connect, and then you can put in the server, which is, our server name is this. And so I'll share that in the chat. And so again, this will actually only work for people who have an RStudio Connect account already. But even just watching this is valuable for if you choose to get one. But so yeah, so in this window with RStudio Connect account, you can copy and paste in this URL to the server. And then you click next. And then it'll try to connect. And you should have a window pop up. Oh, I didn't know if my one was going to work because I already have it on there. But it'll pop up with a window and ask you to sign into your net ID. And then so I think once you're signed in, it should then have a window that tells you that it worked. So hopefully there are folks who are trying that. Let me know if you're trying that and you can't get it to work. Or if you did get it to work, feel free to share that.
Looks like it's required me to install packages prior to listing what I can connect to.
Huh. Oh. Which packages is it asking for?
There it is. Okay, so when you have the publishing accounts dialog box window, and you click connect, you saw the Shiny apps in the RStudio Connect. When I first did it, it was blank, but it gave me a little prompt to install the libraries that allows exactly those two options now appear. So I'm now to the point where I can enter the RStudio Connect server.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I don't think it made me do that. Maybe I already had those packages installed.
That could be, yeah.
Are other folks trying this? I can't remember who on the list had an account, but. Okay. Oh, yeah. So the list of approved, it looks like Jeremy, Katie, and Michelle were the ones who had a chance to be able to sign up. So has anyone been able to successfully connect and then have this show up? Ah, yes. Yeah, Katie, because you're, yeah, I know all of your stuff is not openly shareable, so that's fine. But at least it's helpful to see the process. And then at some point, if you want to use this service, you'll be able to. Okay, so it looks like other folks give me thumbs ups. I'm sorry for everyone who doesn't have an account yet, but it's still valuable to see this. Okay, so once you have the connection to the server, you should now hopefully at the top right of your RMD see this blue publishing button. And so when you click on it, I think probably everyone will only see this RStudio Connect option so far. But yeah, so if you click RStudio Connect, or if it came up automatically, it might have done that. Then you'll have two options. You can either publish a finished document or publish with the source code. And so publish with the finished document, what it'll do, it'll go and it'll just pull the HTML file that you most recently rendered and publish that. But if you publish with the source code, it pulls the Rmarkdown itself and then any data files that were needed, and then it renders it on the server. And so I'm going to say that this is the preferred option to include the source code with the RMD itself. And that's because if you've like forgotten to render the HTML lately, it might be out of date, whereas this will always be up to date. So I'm going to click connect or click that. And then, so yeah, like I said, in terms of what the source code is here, I have this Rmarkdown file, and then there's a few data files that are needed in order to run it. And so it's going to pull those onto the server too, I think. I actually haven't done this yet, so this is a little bit of a mystery for me too, but Okay, and then there's a title that you can put in here. And I don't know if I should change this. Yeah, I'll call this data sets README. And I'm going to publish and see what happens. So it's a little exploratory for me too. I haven't had a chance to use RStudio Connect until recently. Okay, while it's waiting, I can actually show you all an example of what it looks like once one's been published. Oops. Okay, looks like it's trying to deploy that. Okay, it's still working. But I published a different Rmarkdown on RStudio Connect last week. So if you want to see an example, especially for folks who are not able to do this with their own Rmarkdown right now, you can see an example of this. So this is the rendered Rmarkdown that I have. And actually some of the materials for this workshop are in this Rmarkdown, because this is a set of workshop materials. But so we have a bunch of different options over here that you can sort of play around with. And there's documentation on the RStudio website for all of these different things. But so for example, you can set, only certain people can see this, or everyone can see this. You can add collaborators. So I've added a collaborator to this Rmarkdown. Then another useful thing is the scheduler tab. And so I know some folks mentioned interest in having like regular updated Rmarkdowns. And so I think this is how you do that. If you select schedule output for default, then you can set things like, how often should it be rerun or re-rendered? When should it be re-rendered? And then you can actually send an email to people once it's been updated. So you can add people's email addresses here. And I think, I haven't tried this yet, but I think once it's been re-rendered, it'll automatically send people an email with a link to the new content. So it sounds like that's something that could be useful to some folks and is worth exploring. And then there's something else in here too I think is useful. Can't remember. Oh, well, yeah. So there's a log that shows when something has been re-rendered. So yeah, and then if you have this set so that anybody can view it, oops, like I do here, you should be able to then send the link to anyone, and then they can look at your rendered Rmarkdown. And then I think I again haven't tried this yet, but I think if you have shiny components in your Rmarkdown, they should be able to be dynamic and usable in this published version. Okay, and it looks like it is still trying to publish this one. I don't really know why it's taking so long. Not very complicated. Has anyone else been able to be successful in getting one of their Rmarkdowns onto RStudio Connect? Or are there problems?
I'm seeing this item is incomplete.
Okay.
I don't know if that's what you were saying as far as still waiting. I still have that something like you have there, where it's like a tar gzip file as kind of the last bit of output there in the bottom left of the screen. So
but it's not running anymore like this. If you can see, there's a stop sign and the little ticker here. That's not running anymore.
I got a spinning symbol. I don't have a stop sign.
So it may still be trying to deploy this, or it may not be. It's hard to tell. It didn't take very long when I used that other one I just showed. It didn't take very long for it to deploy, but it's also just text mainly, so in some Markdown. So it might just be a matter of waiting. But also I assume if there's some errors that happen that prevent it from being put on there, that would also probably show up here. And I guess then this is potentially an argument too for just putting your, so choosing the other option when you're publishing it, where you just push the finished product, because it's probably faster because it's not actually trying to render it like on the fly. So yeah, we'll see. Was anyone else? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Kristina. Yeah, quick question. So when you send up the Rmarkdown file and all the associated files, say you had a function script, a CSV file, or something else that needs to go with it, it's kind of like an R project going up to the online destination where, you know, if you run this every day and get updates every day with daily data, it's got the timer, say 6 a.m. It's just going to run that script again, that Rmarkdown script, and everything that's associated with it, and kind of just rerun all that code again to reproduce the document at that time of the day. Is that kind of how it works?
Yeah, but now that I'm thinking about it, like if you have a set of data that you push to the server, like that data is not going to update unless you update it, probably. Like I imagine the updating of the data underlying it would only work if, like, for example, the data is being pulled from some URL or some API where it's being updated regularly.
Yeah, and that's how this particular script I have works. It goes and gets the data online.
Okay.
So it's kind of like that process, but you know, it's running through the code, it's redoing it every day or however frequently you have it update.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's what it should do with the scheduler. And again, I haven't actually used it yet, and you want to probably try it out and play around with it and see what happens. But it seems like that's what it's supposed to do.
Okay. Just it is really more for my understanding on how it works.
Yeah.
My deployment failed with an error, so unfortunately I won't be having anything to show anytime soon.
Well, hopefully it gave you some useful information in the with it failing, so that you can troubleshoot. I don't know what it shows you.
I'll have to go through it. It may be more efficient if I were to maybe simplify things and just have the data set pre-canned and put it up there and just build the complexity in, you know, piece by piece. It may have been too much for this particular example, I guess.
Yeah, that is possible. And I think there are probably some limits that each user has on RStudio Connect, but I have no idea what those limits are. I think they should be like, you should be able to put fairly heavyweight things on there. Like that was one of the reasons that we got RStudio Connect, because you can also put your Shiny apps on there. And so the free version of that for Shiny apps, shinyapps.io, is like, it's very slow. And so the idea was that hopefully, especially with Shiny apps, when people start to get more complicated ones with more data, or they're doing more intensive analyses, that RStudio Connect should be able to keep up with that. And I think that'd be the same thing for Rmarkdowns too, but that might not be the case. Okay, we are technically out of time. Sorry, I should have maybe included a little less content, or made this a little bit longer. But yeah, really briefly, I won't actually be able to show it here, but know that there is a free version of this. If you want to publish to RPubs, that is another option. And I meant to go through and show everyone how to do that too. But yeah, if you want to play around with that, I did find RPubs pretty easy to use. And there is a documentation on RStudio Connect for some of these questions about scheduling and stuff. This would be a good place to look. I'm going to try to compile notes from this workshop, including all the links to resources, because I realize there's a lot of resources I included, but like I don't expect people to have bookmarked them. So I'll try to do that, and I will send everyone out an email when I've sent out, or when I've published the YouTube video, and when I have compiled the notes from this workshop, so that people can refer back to them. So sorry again for kind of running out of time here, and not resulting in the success of having anyone with a published Rmarkdown, but Yeah,
I
if you're
was able
trying to do
publish.
that. Oh, what?
I was able to publish.
Oh, you were? Oh,
Yeah.
awesome. Do you want to share the link to that?
I don't think I made it public just because it's like basically I experimented with making a dashboard of the rodent data.
Okay, that's fine.
But it did work.
Yay. Okay. Well then, yeah, this is, I would say, generally a success. But yeah, I mentioned earlier on our office hours. If folks would like more help with this content, if you're troubleshooting anything R related, like feel free to drop in. And I would love to help out with solving all of your problems, at least related to R and Rmarkdown. So yeah, the link to the office hours is there in the chat. So yeah, thank you everyone for showing up. This was great. And yeah, thank you for being a little bit of guinea pigs when it comes to the RStudio Connect stuff. That was definitely the most untested part of this. So thank you for your patience.
This is great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me too, of course. So